The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
Well, I'm fighting it again. I don't even know how this one happened. The kid wasn't even sick this time. I can't. Who do I blame it on when I get sick and no one in my household is sick? I don't go anywhere. How the crap am I catching anything? Anyway, welcome to the week, everybody. It's Fantasy NBA Today. I sound angry, but that's just because I have no high register to my voice right now. So this is fake angry Dan, and also someone who's not angry at all. So Ethan, you got to bring the bright sunshine on today's podcast. Dan Besbris, Ethan Norof. It's Fantasy NBA Today. It's Monday. You got the two of us every Monday through the offseason. Ethan, how was your weekend? Happy Passover and Easter weekend to you.
Oh, thank you, sir. Likewise, filled with a lot of Seder-esque activities. And, in terms of feeling mad, I just imagine this South Park-looking cartoon character kind of waddling around who's not really mad, but he just sounds a little bit mad. So if you can imagine cartoon Dan, but in the South Park animation, that's what's going on in my head right now.
That's fairly accurate, actually. Although when I woke up in the morning, I had my head was exploding and my chest was tight, but luckily, the combination of Sudafed and Tylenol is remarkably effective with treating the symptoms of stuff like this, but nothing really quite makes laryngitis go away. There's just you can try all the sorts of things, and my only hope here is age-old broadcaster techniques to try to just make my voice sound louder than it is, and I hope that that's going to come through on this thing. But we got a new week coming up here. Fantasy NBA Today, you can follow me on Twitter at Dan Besbris. Ethan is at Ethan. You have an underscore in that thing? I forgot to check again. Ethan Norof? You do? Yeah. At Ethan_Norof. I thought so. And then usually I'm I'm healthy enough to remember to double check these things before hitting the record button. But today I'm giving myself a pass. So at Ethan_Norof, at Dan Besbris, at Hoop Ball Fantasy. This is, of course, Hoop Ball and Hawaiian Isles Kona Coffee presentation. This would be the kind of day where I could really use the digestive system that could handle caffeine. I need it, man. I need it hard. I need something to wake my tuchus up. I use the right word from Passover weekend. So a few topics at hand. I have a lesson learned that I want to throw into today's show because we got yours last week, so I feel like it's only fair if I do one of mine. But also, we're a week into the NBA playoffs, so I haven't talked about it at all on this podcast. There are really only two. Maybe three, I don't know. I'd love your opinion on this. Maybe two competitive, compelling series so far. And not surprisingly, it's the 3-6 and 2-7 in the Western Conference. The playoffs have not grabbed my attention the way that they normally do. And I don't know about you, but I'm hoping that changes as we go forward.
Yeah, I think it will, and I think that's pretty common for a lot of fans right now. I hate to be that guy, but not having LeBron in the playoff picture, it is a factor. People tune in because they love him. People tune in because they hate him. Yeah. They tune in because they want to see what's going on with LeBron. So having him not be a part of this is definitely a factor. And then you have a team like, the Celtics-Pacers series, and with the Pacers missing Victor Oladipo for so much of the season, including in the postseason, it's really taken the luster out of that particular matchup. Otherwise, I think that would be a different conversation. And then you have some matchups where, Milwaukee, Detroit, I don't think anyone kind of was too gassed up for that one at the onset of when that was set up to be the 1 versus 8 seed. And the same thing similarly for Toronto and Orlando. And no disrespect to Magic fans because I know they've been waiting and, this is their moment. But I think there's just not a lot of good first-round gas kind of in the tank. And as we get through the second round and then ultimately to the conference finals and to the finals, we'll get more of that excitement, that natural buildup.
Do you think the Clippers or the Magic have any chance of taking a second game in their series?
I'd give the Clippers a better chance than the Magic. I think the Magic really played a really nice game one and kind of capitalized on the momentum of the Raptors being maybe underprepared or not quite ready for the Magic's initial punch. It's always fun when those underdogs get game one, but then game two happens and reality starts to set in. I do think the Clippers have a better chance because I think they're a better team than the Magic. Let's start there. But also because I think they just match up a little bit better than the Magic do with the Raptors. And for the Clippers, even before DeMarcus Cousins was lost for the series and what feels like the remainder of the postseason, regardless of how far the Warriors ultimately go, I think the Clippers are one of those teams that, like we saw earlier in the series, when they were down big, they can get on a run because they have some of those guys who can create instant offense. Lou Williams obviously comes to mind. And, that Lou Williams, Montrezl Harrell pick and roll is just about as unstoppable as any other in the league these days.
Yeah, you started to see Golden State maybe take him a little bit more seriously in that third game. After getting up big, they didn't let him back into the ball game. The surprise of the first round for you, Ethan, so far, is it the fact that Portland went up 2-0 on a team that they apparently just didn't want to play after trying to tank away the last game of the regular season? Is it the fact that Denver and San Antonio have each won a road game despite being two of the best home teams in the NBA? For me, and maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, we'll come back to you in a second here, the biggest surprise is that Utah just hasn't even really put up a fight so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely somewhat surprising, although that game 3 could have easily gone a different way, had a couple of shots fallen, a couple layups, some missed dunks, things like that, even free throws. I think my answer would have been, had Brooklyn come out and won their previous game, they let that lead slip away, and Philadelphia obviously took a 3-1 lead as a result. They let Game 4 get away from them. If Brooklyn had been able to take a hold of that game and tie the series up 2-2, I would identify that as my biggest surprise, just because seemingly everybody was on Philly coming into that series. Mm-hmm. And, on paper, Philadelphia has more talent, but Brooklyn, as they have throughout the regular season, kind of plays above what they have on paper. I think the most surprising series in terms of how compelling it's been and how different it has looked at times, for me, has to be Denver-San Antonio.
Yeah.
And the reason is because, San Antonio was one of those teams where, when everybody was making their playoff predictions before the year started and LeBron was in the Western Conference, the Lakers were still in the conversation, and the Pelicans were in the conversation. You had all these teams that could be in the mix for those final few seeds. A lot of people had San Antonio out of the mix entirely for the playoffs.
Yeah, doesn't that feel like a vast underestimation of Greg Popovich?
Of course, and I think guys like, Derek White and Bryn Forbes and all those San Antonio-esque players. I mean, when you can resurrect Donatas Motiejunas from China after the last 2 years and stick him in a playoff rotation and actually have success, I mean, that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. So I think the fact that they're, where they are in their series and they're tied up 2 apiece now, I think that's going to be a series that could easily go to the 6th or even 7th game.
Yeah, that one's looking more and more like one where home court initially felt like it was going to be the difference, and maybe it still will be. But the fact, like you said, it's been a weird series, and we saw Denver finally make some adjustments in Game 4, most notably to their starting lineup. Will Barton got sent to the bench, where he has excelled in the past as kind of like their scoring sixth man type. Torrey Craig got the start. That felt like a pretty good move for the Nuggets.
Yeah, and Torrey Craig is one of those guys. I mean, if you're somebody who's only watched the Nuggets, during the postseason and didn't follow them during the regular season, you're one of those people who's going, Torrey Craig? Who? Like he's one of those types of players. But he's a guy, who spent a lot of time in the G League. He's really earned his way up. And, he's one of those guys that really doesn't need the ball in his hands to make an impact. But he came into the starting lineup, 18 points, 8 boards, 5 threes, a block, a couple steals, played 37 minutes. It wasn't like he was just out there a nominal starter only. I mean, he played the majority of that game.
Yeah, they needed him. They needed somebody, like you said, that could do stuff without the ball, someone that could defend a little bit better. Portland OKC, and there's a game that's going to happen late on Sunday night that's going to occur after we record this podcast. We're recording it a day in advance. So, things may pivot a bit based on how that game ends versus what we say right now. But as it stands at the moment, it's been a very home court dominated series through the first 3 games. Does that mean that Portland escapes this series? Because if so, they have a pretty winnable matchup in round 2. The winner of Denver-San Antonio, I feel like a lot of teams wanted to be in that 2, 3, 6, 7 bracket in the Western Conference this year.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I don't want to say OKC is dead in the water, but Portland's definitely looking like let me put it like this. Damian Lillard is looking like a better player than Russell Westbrook right now, and Russell Westbrook just came off his 3rd straight season of averaging a triple-double. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, it's been a weird season for Oklahoma City. They're obviously their best run of the year coming when Paul George went on his insane midseason surge, and I don't know if maybe he'd ever got fully healthy again, but it seems if we had to predict right now, and I'll pull back the curtain a little bit. We're recording this Sunday around lunchtime. So we do not yet have the results of the Toronto-Orlando game. We don't have the results of the Portland-OKC game. So we're going into this prediction mode a little bit blind, certainly with less info than you guys, listeners, all have listening to the podcast. Do the top seeds come out of both of those matchups? Is it Denver-Portland in the conference semis?
Man, I'm not ready to. I feel more confident in Portland topping OKC than I do in Denver topping San Antonio. You know, the Nuggets have looked good at times and even for parts of games, but there hasn't been one entire game where you looked at Denver. I mean, even Game 4 where they tied up that series, you said, okay, they played really well for about half of that game overall, or even maybe 3/4 if you want to stretch it out, but they haven't put together one complete game yet, and the Blazers have done that. So for me, that's why I feel more confident with the Blazers than I do with the Nuggets. But I think if you were asking me if I had to make a call, I would say Blazers. And you know what? It's going to be tight, but I think I'd have to take the Spurs.
Interesting. I think I'm going to lean Nuggets. I'm hoping that they found something in that Game 4 that changed the way they were playing these things. Warriors, presumably Rockets in the second round. You and I will probably talk again around the time that series is getting going. Do the Rockets actually have a chance? Because they've looked pretty good here down the stretch. They were an awesome value against a Utah team that was a little bit overrated coming into the playoffs. Rockets were a little bit underrated despite James Harden. I know they were still kind of the public team there, but not as much as perhaps last year. I mean, you know, we see the Warriors, they've let down their guard in that second game against the Clippers. They came back. They've obviously put their foot down on Game 3. Kevin Durant looked more like himself. Are we trying to create drama where there is none, or can the Rockets really push the Warriors this year, even with their sort of revamped roster?
Well, if you're looking for reasons to like the Rockets are up 3-0 in a series where James Harden just came off of one game where he shot 3 of 20 from the floor. He hasn't come close to 50% in any of the 3 games to date. In fact, he's 25 of 70 from the field, and they're up 3-0.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying, you know, that the Jazz are the Warriors, because obviously they're not. But if you're looking for reasons for optimism, for as many people want to sit here and say that, well, as the Rockets go, it's going to be all about James Harden. This year, it's going to be about more than James Harden, because Chris Paul, let's start there, is healthy, and that's a big deal. Clint Capella looks healthy. PJ Tucker is leaving an impact, another guy who doesn't need the ball to sort of make his money, so to speak. And Eric Gordon is playing big minutes. If you want to look for reasons for pessimism, the Rockets still have no bench. But that's been the case the entire year. And it's not like the Warriors are exactly blessed with depth, especially now that Cousins went down as well. So I think it's going to be a closer series than some people might have predicted or continue to predict. It would not surprise me if it goes 6 or 7 games. And I do think the Rockets have a little bit more of a chip on their shoulder, a little bit more gas in the tank, a little bit more oomph in the belly, if you want to call it that, because they've been so close and been denied for the last couple of years. And, you know, that tends to add a little bit more fuel to the fire when you're going back for something you haven't yet achieved.
Do you think that what Utah has done to James Harden is creating a little bit of a playbook for other teams in the NBA? Like, they've just sat on his left arm. They've put a defender basically not even in front of him at times. They've put a defender to his left, and they try to have someone like a Rudy Gobert available to sort of roam the paint a little bit. And I know that the Rockets are up 3-0, and so picking on James Harden is a foolish endeavor right now. What good's it going to do you, because they're winning ball games? But if he played like this in a series against the Warriors, they would get smoked, wouldn't they?
I don't think they would have enough offense, and the whole pace of the game, the whole style of the game is going to be so different. And, you know, when you're talking about Rudy Gobert or you're talking about Kevon Looney, those are two very different players as well. So I think that's also worth mentioning. I do think the way that the Jazz have defended James Harden is something that we've seen prior with some teams. I mean, I remember one Rockets game very specifically against the Lakers where Josh Hart was literally guarding James Harden with his hands behind his back. Like he was facing him up in front of him, but his hands were behind his back as if they were tied up behind his back because he didn't want to get called for the non-existent reach-in foul. So I think you're going to try to see teams, the Warriors or any other, force Harden off of his preferred spot and off of his preferred hand. But at the end of the day, when the guy is as talented as he is and he's still able to get to the free throw line in game 3 16 times despite that defensive tactic, you can only imagine what he's able to do when his shots are falling.
Yeah, good point. 2 hot takey kind of questions, and then we're going to move into the fantasy realm. Hot take question number 1. Are the Warriors actually better without Boogie Cousins going forward? It seemed like this year he really made an impact for them when they played the Nuggets, and not a ton against a lot of other teams. And against a team like Houston, it seems like he'd get run right off the floor. So are they better now, not having to worry about giving him his minutes in a potential round 2 matchup?
Well, I think they're more familiar. And what I mean by that is, they've had this construct that's obviously worked for them for the last couple of seasons. And Cousins was a new variable. He was a new dynamic in that mix. So much of this year was spent getting him up to speed, then introducing him into that mix, expanding his role accordingly. So there was just a lot of change for everybody involved. It changed the structure in how they played. So now you have a Warriors team that needs to go back to a more familiar style. And it's not really a knock on Cousins or a knock on his particular fit with the team, but it's his particular fit with the team in this context, coming off of the injury and all of that constant readjustment. As a result, this more familiar style may be beneficial to them as they try to kind of cohesively come together down the stretch.
Hot take question number 2. Should Utah have mortgaged the farm to get Mike Conley at the trade deadline? Because I'm thinking they should have.
I'm really surprised that trade didn't happen. I think even Mike Conley expected it because the way, I think there was one final home game he played just before the trade deadline. And, he was basically saying bye to everybody, to the media, to teammates, to arena workers. I mean, just about everybody who had been around him. And so, if you're the Jazz, I know that they're a franchise that doesn't like to swing big for the fences in order to just mortgage the future. But man, it's felt like right time, right place that they really wanted to make a move. And, if you had Mike Conley on this team and not Ricky Rubio, assuming Rubio would have gone back the other way in the deal, I think you're looking at a different dynamic for sure.
That's a huge potential upgrade that just was not. I mean, they are not a championship caliber team without one more offensive option. I love Joe Ingles. I do. He's a massive hoop ball guy. He has been for a couple of years. Rudy Gobert, outstanding. He makes his impact on offense, but largely more so on defense. And then Donovan Mitchell, who's got to figure out his efficiency stuff. But they need someone else. They need someone else they can go to if Mitchell is cold like he was in Saturday's game. And I don't know. I think sometimes the Rockets have done it. Sometimes the Phillies done it. Sometimes you just got to go for it. I know that the Warriors still stand in the way, but anyway, there were years left on Conley's contract. It wasn't like it was going to cost him everything immediately. I like when teams just put their what do you want to call it? Your stuff on the table. Chips. We'll go with chips on today's podcast.
Sometimes you just got to go for it. And if you're the Jazz, I think you have to also think about what you're asking from Donovan Mitchell at 21 years old. So at 21 years old, not only did he average 20 shots per game during the regular season, but through the first 3 games of this series against the Rockets, he's at 64 shots taken, if that math is right. Yeah, 64 shots taken, and he's made a single digit in every one of them. He's made 21 of them. Yeah, and so you can't ask a player to carry the load like that until he's proven to be somebody like James Harden. They're asking Donovan Mitchell to play the James Harden role against James Harden. That is very difficult.
Yeah, and on a team that doesn't have quite the same floor spacing and just isn't built to be a one-man gang where everybody else sort of floats around that guy in a way that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I think opportunity missed. Jazz are going to need to do something to get up and over that hump, and obviously we'll reassess that come off-season time, which may or may not be very soon. We will find out shortly. Fantasy stuff. Ethan, you gave us a lesson learned last week, and I had somebody tweet at me to say, Dan, have you done one of your lessons yet? And the answer actually is no. I've been shirking my responsibility here on Fantasy NBA Today, and I haven't dropped one into the mix. So I thought today might be a good day to start talking about one. I think this is actually a thread that I could carry for either a few shows or even throughout the offseason, and it has to do with punting. And I've always taken more of a blanket approach to this where I try not to punt during a draft, because when you punt during a draft, you take guys off the board for yourself, and it limits your player pool, it limits your ability to succeed. I do think there are scenarios where it makes sense to give up on stats. I've talked about that at great length on the podcast as well. Basically, if you get to like the 35-40% mark of the year and you're just the worst at something, even if you have some one guy on your team that's actually okay at it, that's a fine time to go ahead and pull the plug on that. An example of which, this most recent season, I had a team that I built that was very, very bad at scoring. I was going to be in the bottom 2 in points in my Roto League. And so I thought, all right, I have 2 opportunities here. I can really try to push for it and try to build this category, and maybe I could gain a point or 2 at the very best, but I'd have to sacrifice a lot in other statistical categories. Or I just give up on it, and I go from being in either second to last or dead last to just guaranteeing I'm in last place. And so I pulled the plug. I just said, to hell with it. I'm not even going to try for points anymore. I'm going to trade away. At the time, it was TJ Warren, who ended up sitting the last 2 months of the year, but I didn't know that was going to happen at the time. And it looked like a really smart trade to pick up someone who was really good at rebounding, assists, steals, blocks, and that ilk. But as I get now to the end of the year and I look back on a season gone by, one of the things that jumps out to me is, because I am so laser focused on Roto leagues most of the time, I ignore the fact that in a head-to-head format, your only real goal come playoff time is to have more games played than your opposition on a given playoff week. So maybe punting turnovers is not the worst thing in the world in a head-to-head format. Ethan, I know this is a very broad, big-picture topic to get started on here, but where do you stand on punting as a whole? And then we can start to sort of focus in on different individual scenarios.
I think punting is one of those strategies where, it's for me, it's an ideology that I can kind of get into as I prepare for a draft, but I cannot go into a draft and especially if I don't know what pick I'm going to have, right? If you know you're going to be the 8th pick in a 12-team league, then you can sort of forecast who's going to be on the board, who's not going to be, depending upon slot, depending upon who you're drafting with, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're flying blind and you don't know until half an hour, 45 minutes before draft time where you're even picking, it's going to be hard to say, hey, you know what? I'm definitely punting field goal percentage because of whatever the reason might be. So for me, it's one of those things to say, okay, look, of these, let's say 25 players that I've identified as being the right value, maybe they're too low in terms of ADP, maybe they're being overlooked, things like that. Here are 25 guys that I really look. Oh, of these 25 guys, look, a lot of them are high turnover guys, or a lot of them are low free throw percentage guys, things like that. Then that's how I kind of work my way into saying, okay, here's a potential category for me to punt, because if I can be strong here, and here, I don't mind being weaker in this particular area or in that particular area. I mean, I liken it to a scenario where, if you have the, let's say the 3rd overall pick in your draft, and you're expecting to get a James Harden, a Kevin Durant, even a Giannis, a player like that, but the first 2 picks in your draft are all of a sudden Giannis and Harden, and you're expecting to go Harden, and so you're going to punt field goal percentage, but now you've wound up with AD on your team. Well, obviously you're not going to punt field goal percentage at that point. So
yeah,
it changes everything with the very first pick. So I think to remain flexible is important, but once you've invested those first 2 to 3 initial picks, those first round, second round, third round picks, and then you can see, hey, my team is clearly going to be strong in assists, and I'm going to really need to work hard to catch up on rebounds. Then maybe rebounds becomes the category for me that I'm looking at devaluing along the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, is this something you think about more so in a head-to-head or Roto League, or both, or neither?
To me, it's easier to punt in a head-to-head league than it is in a Roto League, just because when you punt in a Roto League, you're so far back in that one category, especially anything above 10 teams, that you're almost deflating your strength in the process. Because if you're the number one team in field goal percentage and you get 10 points for that category in a 10-team league, but you're the last team in free throw percentage and you get 1 point, well, that's an average of 5.5. That puts you right in the middle. That doesn't really do much for you in that format.
Right. If you're going to be able to punt something in Roto, you basically need to be able to guarantee that you're going to win 2 or 3 other categories for the average to make sense. You need to get And 10-team league is an easy one to do here because the averages are just just easier to take. But if you say, okay, I am punting free throw percent, you basically need to guarantee that you win field goal percent, rebounds, and blocks so that you're getting 31 points out of those 4 categories. And even that is still, just over 7.5 points per category, which is probably enough to win your league in a 10-team league. If you can get up to 75 points overall on the year, that should be enough to win it. But if you're not, like you said, if you're only winning 1, and by the way, you have to pull it off perfectly. Because if you get even 2nd, 3rd, 4th place in any of those 3 categories I mentioned, that drags the average down again. But like you said, the more I look at my head-to-head leagues, the more I look at the results of them this year, I sort of went back to it and I poured over the numbers and I thought, you know what? Like, I had a team that I actually attempted to win turnovers every week. I had a weird team. It got reconstructed. I don't want to get into the specifics of it, but come playoff time, my first thought was, I got to figure out a way to get like 4 or 5 more games than my opponent. And so all of a sudden, my advantage in turnovers evaporates. I don't know that there's a massive gain to trying to win turnovers in a head-to-head league. Yes, it'll help you all season long. You might, be a few games over 500 in that category where otherwise you wouldn't have been. But come playoff time, that category gets a big poop emoji on it because you're just physically trying to outgame. You're just trying to outmuscle your opposition, and that's a category you're just gonna lose if you have a bunch more games than the team you're playing.
Exactly. And so, that's one of those reasons for me that turnovers tends to never be a category where I intentionally punt in a head-to-head format. And on a larger conversation, like, to me, that's not even a category that should even exist. Like, I understand why there are some out there who only exclusively play 8-cat when it comes to head-to-head or even rotisserie formats. So I get it from that perspective. And I think, based on the composition of your team, your team, remember, it's also going to change as the year progresses, based on injuries, based on trades, based on all these uncontrollable factors, like, player X gets traded or player X gets injured or player X is forced to miss time, and it's going to carry the weight and resonate with your team differently as a result of that. So I feel like it's really hard to go into a fantasy season saying, hey, I know that I'm going to punt this category and that category. I feel like it's going to depend more on what your initial picks are, where you are in the draft, who you're drafting with, and understand the dynamics of that room, and then being able to make an educated decision to value category X over category Y, realizing that, hey, on my best week, I may not say that I'm punting category Y, but I'm probably not going to win category Y. But right. But on my worst week, I have to win category X for my team to be successful.
Another recency bias example, for me at least, that drives me towards this kind of new but not that new way of thinking is I had a head-to-head league where it's an 11 category one, so you could actually get away with punting a little bit easier because there's just more things, more opportunities on the table. I drafted a team in I think it was like the second to last slot. So I knew I had a pretty good chance to end up with someone like Dame in the first round and probably someone like a Paul George coming back off the turn. So right off the bat, I'm thinking, I got a pretty good shot to end up punting field goal percent, just by nature of who I'm going to end up with. It probably puts me in a tough spot for rebounding as well, although as it turned out, Paul George had a very large rebounding year. Come playoff time, I had been able to pick up Jonas Valanciunas off of the waiver wire. I picked up Thomas Bryant as he started to get going in Washington late in the year as well. And all of a sudden, this team that I had built that I thought I was going to be punting field goal percent and possibly even rebounds, these are categories that I won in the head-to-head playoffs after going something like, 5-12 in them during the regular season. So, like you said, it's not a great idea to slot yourself into these spots early, but because I also did a lot of streaming with my 4 moves a week and sort of pre-planning for these playoff formats, I'm pretty sure I lost turnovers every week, despite actually having kind of a middle-of-the-pack turnover team. So I do think it opens up a little bit. Ethan, I'm someone who actually likes 9 category because I think there is a strategic element to the turnover side, but in the head-to-head playoffs, it's just not even a category worth pursuing. Roto, I I think that's a category that's really easy to win, actually. I think a lot of teams ignore the 9th category, and if you're in a roto league where most of the teams actually hit their games cap or their games limit or whatever you want to call it, if you can end up with 8-9 points out of your turnover category, you give yourself a pretty nice boost over usually the other teams at the top of the pack. So I have pretty strong feelings, and they're very different depending on the format I'm in.
Yeah, I mean, and I think too, like, for me, I'm always in my strategy, regardless of rotisserie, regardless of head-to-head, regardless of number of categories, is put together the best team possible. And so the best team possible has to be aligned in terms of their categorical strengths. That is a mouthful right there, their categorical strengths. But at the same time, I'm not going to say, hey, you know what? This player, he's a really good value. He's someone I like. Oh, but I've predetermined that I'm not going to select high turnover guys, and therefore I'm going to draft somebody with a lower ceiling, with lesser production, and just try to hope that I win that category. Like, to me, that is not a good strategy to implement if you're trying to be successful.
I think your point that your team changes so much as the season goes on is arguably the most important one that we can make in this whole discussion, because whatever your plan was going into the draft or whatever you came out of the draft with, it's going to change. You're going to have guys that get hurt that might have been either a big contributor or a big drag on a particular category for your team. For instance, this most recent season, Victor Oladipo, who was suddenly a terrible free throw shooter, was obviously a very helpful fantasy player overall, but if you lost him on your team, you lost a bunch in a bunch of categories, but you probably actually got better in free throw percent, not a spot you figured that was going to be an issue. Big guys that get hurt, that kill your free throw percent. If they happen to miss a month or two, that's the spot where maybe you end up much better in a category. If you drafted Dwight Howard this year thinking you were punting free throws and he didn't play at all season long, you may ended up with a team that should have lost free throw percent, but ended up getting like third from the bottom, where you actually could have been pretty competitive if you didn't draft some other punt guys. So still generally pretty strongly against it, but I'm now creating this one little caveat for myself, which is head-to-head turnovers. I think that's one where come playoff time, your advantage there is sort of useless. So in terms of building the best team, I don't think, even in a draft, Ethan, for me, I still don't end up punting even partway through a draft. Like, even if I ended up with a team that looked like it was going to be pretty terrible in one category, I'm still looking for the guy that I think is the best player even late in the draft. Like, I'm not going to eliminate dudes because they would destroy a potential punt. I think that's what you were saying earlier as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, I had and not to get into the dynamics of this team, but I had a team this year that, we were into the draft 6 rounds, 7 rounds, 8 rounds in, and all of a sudden I said, wow, I have 0 point guards on my team. That's not great. And so, of course, I'm not going to chase assists at that point. I'm not going to make my next 5 picks all point guards or all assist specialists. But at the same time, you still have to have somebody playing point guard. So yes, I recognize I'm not going to win the assist category, or I may not win the steals category on a weekly basis. But if I'm limiting myself in terms of roster flexibility, then I'm also limiting myself in terms of games played. So what I mean by that is, if I like, regardless of fantasy sport, but especially in basketball, it's, to me, positional versatility is really key to constructing a successful roster. The difference between having a guy who's only shooting guard eligible, only point guard eligible, or being eligible at point guard, shooting guard, forward, I mean, that is, you're giving yourself so many more options. Isaac Bonga was one of my favorite players on Yahoo this year, and everyone's saying, who? Yeah, that Lakers rookie who never played. Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about, Isaac Bonga, because I think he was point guard, small forward, center eligible on Yahoo.
That makes me think that Yahoo didn't know who he was either.
Right, exactly. So I know that's a really obscure example, and nobody's going to start Isaac Bonga, but guys like that versus somebody who's only a power forward, right? Like Paul Millsap. Forgive me because I didn't have any Millsap shares this year, so I'm not sure what his designation was on Yahoo or ESPN. But at one point, he was only power forward eligible. And I love Paul Millsap, but that's a major burn on Paul Millsap's fantasy value if he's only playable at that one spot. And obviously, he'd also be playable at forward as well in that utility forward spot. But that power forward and not having that center eligibility was huge. Hassan Whiteside, I think it was last season, he was power forward and center eligible. This year, he was only center eligible. So that takes him down a peg for me as well, because you can play him in one less spot. While we're on this punting conversation, just a quick tangent to go back to that. And you brought up Dwight Howard. How about anybody who drafted DeAndre Jordan this year? This was the first year of DeAndre Jordan's career where his free throw percentage was actually higher than his field goal percentage. Which is, I mean, and I know he shoots between 60 and 70% every year from the field, but if you're a team and you drafted DeAndre Jordan expecting to punt free throw percentage, this year, but while he was with Dallas, he shot 68%. And when he got to the Knicks, he was a 77.3% free throw shooter.
Yeah. And that's the thing, right? If you drafted him, you probably drafted other bad free throw shooters for your team. You were like, well, I'm already cooked. I might as well take this other guy. Whereas, as it turned out, you could have just drafted DeAndre Jordan as a regular old-fashioned center and still been very competitive in the free throw percent. The flip side of that, by the way, is that I drafted Hassan Whiteside in a couple of spots thinking this guy's going to be a small drag on my free throw percent, and then he ended up being the worst free throw shooter in the NBA. So you just you can make your best laid plans on this stuff, but if you put yourself in that hole, you have to understand what it's doing to your team. I mean, DeAndre Jordan, Ethan, that's a fantastic example of a spot where you don't have to punt anymore. You could have just had him, and you would have been in perfectly fine shape. Get one decent free throw shooter out of it, and you're right back into the middle upper portion of your league in free throw shooting. So that to me is why punting basically anything in Roto on draft day is a very bad decision. You put yourself in a hole right out of the chute.
To me, the worst thing that you can do is what other investment, like let's use the stock game as an example, right? Who sits there and says, you know what, I'm going to build my portfolio. I'm going to just let it sit. I'm not going to touch it. And however it performs, that's how it performs because I'm sticking to my strategy no matter what, right? No smart investor moves forward with that over time and expects a positive return on interest. You have to be able to adjust and be able to be flexible depending upon what the market is giving you and what the market is taking from you. So if we apply that same line of thought to fantasy sports, if somebody goes in and says, you know what, I'm going to punt turnovers and I'm going to punt free throw percentage and I'm going to draft a team where everything lines up for that to be the case and I'm never going to adjust along the way, I bet you that team doesn't make the playoffs 10 out of 10 times. And that's, I think, the point for me is like, look, you're going to have to adjust over time. So, yes, you can have a general idea of, hey, I'm playing with a lot of guys or a lot of people who, they really tend to value point scorers or they really tend to value guys who get a lot of steals or a lot of blocks, a lot of the defensive stats. Know your draft room. And if you don't know your draft room, if it's just a room and be able to say, okay, they're going more off of last year's numbers. They're going off of the pre-ranks. They're clearly valuing this particular categorical skill set. That word is giving me major problems today. Anyhow, the point being is that's how you kind of discover the undiscoverable, right? Those hidden values. You kind of play money ball within the room and understand, okay, if a lot of point scorers are going off the board early, maybe I need to load up more on the guys who rack up the defensive stats because that's who everyone's going to be after. And you give yourself those assets and that balance to make a trade as you need to make those roster swaps along the way. I think having a solid foundation but having optionality is the best way to build a team. And when you're talking about fantasy or you're talking about reality, I mean, before the Sixers were quote unquote fully processed, that's what we heard of a lot from Sam Hinkie is saying, look, I want to have a foundation in place, but I want to also have optionality to be able to make a move when I need to make a move. If you look at a team like the Detroit Pistons, right? Pistons fans were thrilled that their team made the playoffs. They haven't been there in a while. There's a lot of good juju, if you want to call it that. And I get that because if you look at the construction of that team, their foundation is so flawed between the monstrous contracts of Andre Drummond and Blake Griffin that they're probably going to have a really hard time building anything worth building in the next year or two at least. They do not have that optionality. They can't move out and move in on anything else because they're so stuck to those two players and their massive contracts. So having that foundation, but also be able, with the ability to be malleable or pliable or flexible along the way to adjust your need. And when the right situation does arise, to have the capacity to go for it, that's how you build a successful team.
Last question for you on the punt stuff, and we'll obviously circle back to this at some point later in the offseason. Might be sooner, it might be later. I don't know. I don't want to say always, but I often end up with very weak scoring teams, and I think that's just my nature because I find that other categories are really easy to win when everybody else is just grabbing the dudes that take a lot of shots and score a lot of points. if you kind of zig when everybody's zagging, you end up with a boatload of steals, blocks, assists, and rebounds. And, that's obviously 4 categories are more important than 1. Is there a category?
You wind up with a team full of Joe Ingles, your guy.
Yeah, my guy. I got Joe Ingles. I got like Dwayne Dedmon and Draymond Green and all these guys that don't take any. Pat Beverly is probably my favorite point guard.
You got one of those teams where everybody in the league looks at your team and goes, what?
Yeah.
How is this team so good?
Yeah.
What is going on here?
It's exactly right. I'm always like second or dead last in points and then really good at 8 other categories. And everybody's like, well, that's a weird way to do it. Do you have a category like that, Ethan, where you just always end up kind of near the bottom because it's not in your nature to draft it?
Yeah, rebounds.
Huh, interesting. I feel like we all probably have that, the more that I think about it.
Yeah, and it's not that I'm anti-rebound, obviously. The majority of how I did my work as a single man was on the rebound. Hey-yo! But, on the other side of that, I feel like a lot of the emphasis on the 3-point shot, has drawn bigger players out away from the basket. And those guys who are more traditionally inside, unless it's a Rudy Gobert or somebody of that difference-making capacity, and Andre Drummond on the right team, you have a lot of guys drifting further away from the basket. So to me, I would rather draft a Brook Lopez than a Hassan Whiteside in today's NBA,
Yeah, and I mean, if you take a look at some of the best rebounders in the NBA, it correlates pretty strongly with some of the worst free throw shooters in the NBA. So, targeting that category tends to hurt you almost immediately in one of the other ones. And obviously that's not entirely true. You could wipe out some of the first-rounder types like a Joel Embiid,
right.
Karl Anthony Towns, Anthony Davis, Nick Vucevic, the guys up near the top that are good at everything. But if you look at some of the other big rebounders, they have this massive hole in their game. Andre Drummond can't shoot free throws. DeAndre Jordan, until this year, couldn't shoot free throws. Rudy Gobert can't shoot free throws. And obviously they have a ton of fantasy impact. They're very worth having on your team. But most of those guys are not great foul shooters. So you have to have the right build. I totally get it. I try to have one big rebounder shot blocker on my team that does pull down in the free throw, but then that's it, is my strategy. I try to make sure that there's only one bad free throw shooter on my team. I just, I didn't know how terrible Hassan Whiteside was going to be this year. I have strong thoughts on Hassan Whiteside, but I'll save that for our next program. Ethan, any final thoughts on our punt discussion before we put a pin in this thing?
No, I think, the key is like, look, you want to always build on your strengths and minimize your weaknesses, but also don't just ignore a category for the sake of ignoring it, because yes, your team may come out of the draft room and say, hey, you know what, I really need help in the assist category. But 2 or 3 weeks in, there could be a couple of injuries and a couple of waiver wire claims where all of a sudden, hey, you know what? I'm middle of the pack or better in this category, one that I thought I was going to punt going in. So that's how quickly it can change. Players often exceed expectations or don't quite live up to the hype. So I don't think, again, just sticking to the script, for lack of a better way to say it, the same script that you were reading going in is going to work over the course of the full season, because there are so many moving parts and you have to be ready and willing to move with them. Well
said. He is Ethan Norof. I am the see, I told you the adrenaline would get going and the voice would wake up a little bit. Now I'm gonna go stop talking for a little bit. He's Ethan Norof at Ethan_Norof on Twitter. I'm at Dan Besbris. Have a wonderful Monday, everybody. Back tomorrow with Neil Rochlani. We'll talk gambling on tomorrow's podcast. Brandon Marcus Wednesday. And then I think we may be flipping Adrian and Neil Thursday, Friday. So you may get a flip-flop on who's hosting those Thursday, Friday shows. So it'll be likely Neil and either Josh or someone else on Thursday, Adrian and Coach on Friday. That's the upcoming week here on Fantasy NBA Today. Enjoy the playoff games. Ethan, I'll talk to you in a week.
Look forward to it, my man.
So long, everybody.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.